Okay, to understand how to find your way about the brain, you need to remember that the brain starts off as a bulge, like on the end of the neural tube. So if you think about it as the fetus with the stomach and the back and the top and the bottom. Now, as that grows, it bends and you end up with the brain at right angles to the spine and the spinal cord. Okay, so in the adult you have the spinal cord coming up here with all the neurons sending off their axons to the extremities of the body, and then at the top you have the brain. But what that means is that the bit that was at the back is now at the top, and the bit that was at the stomach is now underneath. And that gives you the basic dimensions of the kind of language, if you like, that is used both to navigate within the brain and to name the different areas. So, Latin for stomach, ventrum, ventral. Ventral means towards the bottom of the brain. Latin for back, dorsum. Dorsal means towards the top of the brain. So that's the up-down dimension. Also, rather confusingly, sometimes known as superior and inferior. Now you've got two other dimensions in this structure. You've got front and back, anterior and posterior, and you've got inner or outer, medial and lateral. Again, it's from the Latin. So you can say that you can move anterior, forwards, posterior, back, lateral, outwards, medial, inwards, superior or dorsal, upwards, and ventral or inferior, downwards. So that's the three dimensions, if you like. But those are also used to name areas. So if you think about the brain structure, you have the spinal cord coming up at the bottom, and that goes into the brainstem, called, because it looks like a brain, stem, with the rest of the brain growing out like a flower. At the back of the brain is the cerebellum, which is a very distinct and very regular structure, and that is involved in all sorts of functions, from regulating movement and perhaps some cognition as well. But it sits, if you like, separately. The brainstem is made up of the pons and the medulla, and it controls a lot of basic functions. So when you're walking automatically, when you're breathing, regulating your blood pressure and your blood chemistry, all of that, and a whole lot more besides, is done by the brainstem. Above the brainstem you have subcortical areas, things like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, which regulates a lot of hormone production from the pituitary gland just beneath it. Then you have the thalamus, which is thought of as the brain's central relay station. Information comes in from the eyes and the ears, for example. It is processed in the thalamus and then sent on up to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. Cortex is the skin, if you like, the rind of the brain. It sits over the brain, and it's what gives it that characteristic walnut appearance, that very wrinkled and folded appearance. Basically because our skulls have not quite kept pace with our brain growth, and so it's all had to be squashed in. This makes it very difficult when you're doing brain modelling, incidentally, because while you're trying to model the mathematics of the brain, it's easy enough to do it if it was a nice round ball, but it isn't. It's a crumpled, squish, folded, convoluted thing, so it makes it very complicated. And that's important for things like MEG, but especially EEG. But setting that aside, you have the subcortex with a whole lot of different nuclei in there, like the thalamus and the amygdala, and then you have the cortex sitting on top like a sheet. And it is like a sheet, it's like a sheet of cells, and usually there are 6 layers of those cells. Some areas have slightly fewer layers, some areas have a particular layer that is thicker. So for example, the cells that come up, that send their projections up from the thalamus, make synapses in layer 4, the sensory input layer, and that is much thicker in areas of visual cortex than it would be in, say, areas of motor cortex. In motor cortex, if you look at a cross-section through that, you'll see a thick layer 5, and that's because neurons that are sending their outputs are more plentiful in the motor areas of the brain. So what does cortex look like? Well, it looks like, as I've said, a walnut. There are two halves, the two hemispheres, left and right. There is the front of the brain, and then a great gash across it called the central sulcus, and then the back of the brain. Now, roughly, sensory functions tend to be processed towards the back, and motor and cognitive and decision making tends to be done more towards the front, but that's a rough generalization. Each of these hemispheres is split into 4 lobes. The occipital lobe at the back, which is concerned with visual processing. The parietal lobe at the top, which is concerned with, among other things, spatial processing and also processing your sense of your body, where your body is in space and how it's feeling. At the front, you have the frontal lobe, as the name suggests, and at the side, you have the temporal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is where the prefrontal cortex is located, that people think of as the seat of human function, of consciousness, of thinking. It's a little more complicated than that would suggest, but basically a lot of complicated temporal and spatial processing goes on in the frontal lobe. And then the temporal lobe seems to be more concerned with things like, for example, auditory processing, object recognition, and many other functions, but again, we'll leave that aside for now. So you have these 4 lobes, each with their various specializations, each talking to each other, and information tends to flow through from the back of the brain, the posterior brain, up and over to the front of the brain. Now, within those lobes, there are multiple different areas. So, for example, within visual cortex, you have primary visual cortex and then various secondary cortices being the plural of cortex, and those might be specialised, for example, for colour detection, like the area V4, or motion detection, like the area V5, also known as MT, the middle temporal area, and those have their different functions and they all collaborate to send information about what has just been seen through the brain to the areas which are going to do something about it. You have a primary and secondary auditory cortex and a primary and secondary somatosensory cortex. Now, by somatosensory, I'm referring to senses like touch and, to a certain extent, pain. These are the superficial organs that tell you what is in contact with your skin, how your skin is feeling, whether you've just been burned, that sort of thing. Now, as well as somatosensation, you also have a more visceral set of sensations which are telling you about how your body is feeling. Now, there are 2 kinds of those. One is called proprioception. That is the sense of where your muscles are, where your body is positioned in space. It's an amazing fact that if you close your eyes, you should still be able to move your hand to somewhere that you want to do that. Now, some people have brain damage that means they can't do that. They have to be looking at their hand to be able to move it. But most of us can close our eyes and then reach for something and be pretty accurate. And that's because we can feel where our body is in space, and that's proprioception. So that's dealt with by the somatosensory cortex. As well as that, there are, if you like, deeper sensations, which are the visceral sensations. So information is constantly coming in, for example, from your gut. Now, it's a little known fact that the gut contains masses of neurons, just like the brain. So, if you like, there's another nervous system down there in your stomach processing what's going on, as well as the one up here. And those are in constant communication. You're also getting information about your blood chemistry. You're also getting information about your immune system. And all of that, and a whole lot more, is piling in and being processed by the deep areas of the brain. Now, there's one area of cortex that I haven't mentioned, which is one of the least known and most interesting, and that's the insular cortex. So called because it's like an island, Latin insula, which is cut off from all the other areas of cortex. If you look at the hemispheres, look at them from outwards to inwards, they kind of fold over. So there's this central gap down here, and bridging that gap is a structure called the corpus callosum, which is a great big band of fibres that curves around the brain. And that gap has a medial surface, an inner surface, and in that medial surface are areas of the brain, areas of cortex like the cingulate gyrus, which are involved in processing, if you like, more emotional visceral information, the limbic system as it used to be called. And down in the depths of the brain sit the insular cortices, one on each side obviously, and they are involved in processing visceral sensations. Now they're involved in much else besides, but they seem to be particularly linked to processing emotional information, information about the self. So for example, studies have suggested that the insula is active when you're playing one of the kinds of games that people like to use in neuroscience to assess brain function, so something like the Ultimatum Game, which is a game where people give you an offer, they're given $10 and they offer to split it with you. And if that offer is judged by you to be unfair, your insula will light up. So it's assessing self-related information, but it's assessing it in a very emotional way. So the insula is very interesting. Within each of these areas, you can use the names that I talked about earlier, dorsal, ventral, inferior, superior, medial, lateral, or alternatively anterior and posterior. You can use those to describe areas. So think of it as chopping up the brain into smaller and smaller pieces. So for example, you go from the frontal lobe to the prefrontal cortex. Now you can talk about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which means the top towards the outside, or you can talk about ventromedial, which means the bottom bit towards the inner. And by using those, you can split up these areas of cortex into different chunks. Now, that's important because these different chunks seem to do slightly different things. So for example, DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, seems to be involved in things like short-term memory, whereas VMPFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, seems to be more involved in processing emotional signals. So you can use this language not only to move around within the brain as a whole, but within different areas. So for example, you can talk about an anterior-posterior gradient in the insula. You can talk about anterior and posterior cingulate, or parahippocampal gyrus, or whatever you like to think about it. So it's a useful language to understanding where things are in the brain.